Each year, an estimated 200 Americans are taken hostage overseas. The recent indictments and upcoming high-profile trials of specially designated global terrorists Alexander Ayman Cote and Al-Shafi al-Sheikh serves as a reminder of the impetus for changes to U.S. hostage policy. Cote and al-Sheikh, two of the four men that hostages called the Beatles, face charges in connection to a hostage-taking scheme that resulted in the murders of 4 Americans in Syria: journalists James Wright Foley and Stephen Joel Sotloff, and humanitarian aid workers Peter Edward Kasich and Kayla Jean Mueller. They are sometimes referred to as the ISIS-4. The indictments of Cote and al-Sheikh also serve as a reminder of where we were as a nation regarding hostage cases prior to the development of the current policy, now in its 5th year. I'm Mollie Halpern, and you're listening to An American Mission, mapping the way to making hostage policy a top priority. James Foley, a former Teach for America teacher and writer, found his calling in conflict journalism. His colleagues describe his reporting as humanizing, a reflection of who he was as a person: compassionate, brave, dedicated. Those who did not know James can't help but to respect and admire him. The Foley family says the country's hostage policies were never honestly explained, only that the U.S. government and then President Obama himself told them bringing James home was the highest priority. Diane Foley.
Months after Jim's murder, I did have an opportunity to meet with President Obama, and he repeated at that time that Jim was his highest priority. And I respectfully corrected him on that, because I'm sure it may have been intellectually, but it certainly never was in practice.
When hostages released a proof of life video, the family says the FBI was not allowed to interact with his captors or share any information with them.
It literally felt as if President Obama had tied the hands of the FBI, because when we received captor emails and requests for negotiations, the FBI was not allowed to engage. They could only offer consultation to us.
The Foley family says a U.S. government representative threatened them 3 times with legal prosecution if they dared to raise a ransom. Rob Saley is a former FBI special agent of 23 years who investigated multiple violations, including terrorism. He says prior to the current hostage policy, the U.S. government's response was a roll of the dice that depended on the personalities of those involved. Sometimes the cases were successfully resolved, like the rescues of Captain Richard Phillips and Jessica Buchanan.
In other cases, though, I saw there would be disagreements in policy, especially in regards to terrorism-related kidnappings and hostage-takings. There were a lot of people in the U.S. government that took a stance that the U.S. government couldn't negotiate with terrorist organizations. If a family tried to pay a ransom, they'd be prosecuted. There was not a lot of coordination in the sharing of intelligence, and there was a lot of different efforts that were going on that were stovepiped, and oftentimes some efforts got in the way of others, stepped on each other's toes. So there needed to be something done, especially after the ISIS-4's kidnapping and then their subsequent murder.
James was beheaded 21 months into his captivity, burning a vivid and troubling image into the minds of all who saw the ISIS video. As if her grief wasn't enough, Diane says she also felt betrayed.
I felt as if I had been patronized throughout Jim's captivity, patted on the head, that kind of thing, but never really taken seriously and never really engaged with in any serious way.
The Foley family says the U.S. government abandoned James, Stephen, Peter, and Kayla. 3 weeks after James's death, the Foley family established the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation.
All I can do is ask people to expect our government to have the backs of their own citizens when they go out into the world to work, to help, to study. everybody. I think one of our priorities should be to protect our citizens. And so that is one of our big goals, is to have our government prioritize the return and the safety of our citizens when they travel around the world.
James was an optimist, and Diane says it was his spirit that challenged her to do something positive in light of the horror. Standing up the foundation in her son's name was her rallying cry. It didn't go unheard. James, Stephen, Peter, and Kayla's stories sparked public outrage. It led to President Barack Obama's order for a comprehensive review of U.S. hostage policy. An interagency team of senior government officials conducted the review with support from the National Counterterrorism Center.
The process in which resulted in the creation of PPD-30, it was a pretty rigorous process. It was only going to initially take, I think, 60 to 90 days. It ended up taking almost 9 months, partly because there were some contentious issues that need to be worked out between agencies, but also there were a number of parts of the policy that are pretty complex and needed some careful consideration before they were put into effect.
One of those contentious issues, which remains a topic of much debate, negotiating with terrorists. Diane says she believes that the U.S. government's failure to negotiate condemned James to death. In an email in 2013, the terrorists demanded €1 million for James's release. They also taunted the Foley family, claiming the U.S. government treated them like worthless insects. It is illegal to provide material support to terrorist groups, and the payment of ransoms can be considered material support for terrorism. Ransoms are one source of revenue for terrorists. According to the U.S. Department of Treasury's National Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment of 2015, terrorist organizations collected about $120 million in ransom payments between 2005 and 2012, the year that James was kidnapped. ISIS earned an estimated $45 million in ransom payments in 2014 alone. On June 24, 2015, following the completion of the hostage policy review, President Obama announced the findings from the White House Roosevelt Room. Before the room full of reporters, the president admitted there had been times when the government, regardless of good intentions, let down former hostages and families. He attributed many of the reforms to their recommendations.
These families have already suffered enough, and they should never feel ignored or victimized by their own government. Diane Foley, whose son Jim was killed by ISIL last year, said, "As Americans, we can do better." I totally agree. We must do better.
The report on U.S. hostage policy, released that same day, identified 24 major findings and recommendations in 4 areas: coordination among U.S. government agencies, engagement with families and other stakeholders, the collection and sharing of intelligence, and U.S. policy. The review resulted in the formal issuance of the new Presidential Policy Directive, or PPD-30, called U.S. Nationals Taken Hostage Abroad and Personnel Recovery Efforts. The president also signed a new executive order called Hostage Recovery Activities. Together, these documents updated previous policy directives, reorganized the U.S. government to enable the safe recovery of American hostages, and improved collaboration with their families. The documents also reaffirmed the U.S. no concessions policy. The federal government will continue to refuse to make concessions, such as paying ransom, to terrorist groups holding American hostages.
At the same time, we are clarifying that our policy does not prevent communication with hostage takers by our government, the families of hostages, or third parties who help these families. And when appropriate, our government may assist these families and private efforts in those communications, in part to ensure the safety of family members and to make sure that they're not defrauded. So my message to these families were simple. We're not going to abandon you. We will stand by you.
President Obama and other government officials have long stated that paying ransoms would not only encourage more kidnappings, but also fund the very terrorism the U.S. is trying to combat. Saley explains the nuances.
In the policy now, the U.S. government can negotiate with a terrorist organization. What we can't do is make concessions. That's, I think, a thing that people were hung up on in terms of they thought that talking to a terrorist organization was a concession. It's not. You can talk to an organization such as the Haqqani, do what you can to convince them that taking an American citizen is not in their best interest without making concessions.
The countries committed to a no concessions policy in the Western world are the Five Eyes. That's the U.S., the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Algeria shares the stance and has sponsored UN resolutions to try to ban ransoms worldwide. With the belief that it's the only way to safely recover their citizens, countries like Germany, Italy, and Spain are willing to pay ransoms to terrorist organizations. Coming up on An American Mission, mapping the way to making hostage policy a top priority. Unpacking the policy. Learn the intricacies of the PPD-30 from those who helped develop it.
It became so important. It was inextricably linked to everything that I did.
What the review team identified as problematic in the government's interactions with hostage families and how to address it.
The role of the government and NGOs that can provide support becomes even more important. That circle of trust and that circle of support.
And the efforts to keep the U.S. government accountable as administrations change.
I just feel we're just beginning to crack this, Mollie, to be honest.
I'm Mollie Halpern. Thanks for listening.